Well, we've probably lost 12,000, maybe 20,000 lives in old people's homes. And this is heartbreaking, it's sad, it's tragic. And not even now are most workers and most care home residents being tested. So we've known about this for more than 2 months. And even today, we cannot say that we've tested all those people who may be at risk. And this is a disease where people don't have symptoms, even although they're infectious. And contagion can rush through an old people's home so easily. And we should have been testing. The fateful decision was made on March the 12th, not to test people in the community. And we've been paying the price of it ever since.
At
now,
the time,
I'm not interested in going backwards. I want to go forwards and see what could be done now.
Let's just briefly go backwards, because at the time, when the Deputy Chief Medical Officer was asked why that testing wasn't going on, we were told because it wasn't appropriate. What do you think the real reason was behind stopping testing in the community?
Well, I think we now know they didn't have the capacity, but then they should have been building up the capacity massively. You see, it's not just one-off tests that are needed. You need routine testing of health service workers. I'm amazed that every health service worker hasn't been tested. I'm amazed that every care worker hasn't been tested, but routinely tested so that they are not passing on the disease, and every care home resident. And of course, people who are coming into the country should be tested. People who are in contact jobs, that they're face-to-face jobs with people, should be being tested. And we should be ramping up the testing. But even now, about 3% of the public have been tested. It is not good enough. If your strategy is to test, trace, and isolate, then you've got to be testing.
Mr. Brown, it's so obvious that we should have been testing. And Matt Hancock told us in the House of Commons back in January that we had a world-leading test for coronavirus back at the beginning of the year. What I don't understand, and I think what a lot of people don't understand, is what was the reason? Yes, we know we didn't have the capacity, but why didn't we have the capacity? If we can now get to more or less 100,000 tests a day, why didn't we get that right at the beginning? Was it simply they were too slow?
You should put it on a wartime footing. It's like the mass mobilization of resources. You repurpose manufacturing, you get logistics sorted out using the army far more than we did, and then you get the laboratories set up so you don't have to send stuff to America. It's like a mass mobilization, the equivalent of what we had to do when we were building aircraft in wartime, what you have to do when we had the crisis in 2009 to stop 3 million people being unemployed. You've got to put it like a military operation. And my sadness is that we've lost these 2 months, but now we're in a situation, if we are to prevent a second wave, if we're to get this R figure down, if we're to give people reassurance, then hand washing and social distancing is not enough. What we've got to do is test on a routine and regular basis. All those people who are at risk being in contact with other members of the public should be offered a test. I would have said that instead of the slogan, stay alert, the slogan should be get tested, and we should be providing the facilities for that to happen. Mobile testing, much more of that. It's a military operation, and Boris Johnson should really come to the House of Commons tomorrow and make a statement about how he's going to ramp up testing into hundreds of thousands, not 100,000, hundreds of thousands a day. He should have a summit with all the 4 nations of the country, and they should agree that they'll work together to ramp up testing and, of course, contact tracing, and then the isolation that follows. If SAGE, the medical committee, is asked, I'm absolutely certain it will tell them that there should be faster and bigger and far more extensive testing, and I would like to hear their views as well. But it's clear that the missing element in the next stage, you can't have end the lockdown without offering people the testing that is necessary to reassure.
Let me ask you about generally scientific advice. You know, you were in government for a very long time. You went through health crisis like the swine flu epidemic and so on. The Times today, front page, stop passing the buck, top scientist tells politicians. There's been a real sense that I've had that the government constantly does that. It says we're guided by the science, we're following the science, almost like the scientists are making every decision. But politicians are elected to make decisions based on all sorts of advice. Where is that line? If you were in the position now of being in government, how much do you listen to the advice?
If I'd said in 2009, during the financial crisis, I was simply listening to the experts, people would have laughed at me. You've got to make your own decisions. You've got to get to the root of the problem. Then you've got to decide what you're going to do. And then you've got to throw all your resources at doing it. And we have to do this even now. I worry about a second wave. And the way to prevent a second wave is to do testing. You have social distancing, you have hand washing, but we've got to offer people reassurance. And the reassurance comes from testing. It's the one way that we can get this R figure down quite quickly, but it's mass testing and it's routine testing. Other countries have done it. Others have been advised to do it. I think if the expert committee was asked, what is the number of tests you would need, it would be far higher than what is being done at the moment. Remember, if you're testing 100,000 people a day, that's 0.15% of the population.
But they're not even doing that, because if you look at the numbers, as I've been doing every day, the number of tests being conducted, and these include ones they're sending out in the mail, by the way, but the number of tests is far higher than the number of people being tested. And we're showing the graph that we got here. What's very interesting is you can see the zigzagging of the number of tests. Sometimes it's hit 130,000 they claim were done in a day. But on that day, you're seeing that the number of people tested is actually 65, 68,000. Interestingly, yesterday I noticed that the number of tests went up day on day. The number of people tested fell by 9,000. From 75 to 67, I think it was. That's an extraordinary situation when the government keeps telling us they're ramping up, ramping up, ramping up. If the number of people is dropping by that significant amount, what's going on?
Well, when Boris Johnson did his broadcast, he said hundreds of thousands. I thought that meant not just 200,000, 300,000, 400,000. We were really going to ramp it up. After all, China tested 11 million people in 11 days. You can do it. But what you need to do in government is to get everybody together and say, we are going to do this. I'm not going to take any excuse for it not happening. We mobilize the manufacturing capacity. We mobilize the testing capacity. We mobilize, obviously, also the logistics to do it. And you get it done. I think we will fail to avoid a second wave successfully unless we ramp up testing.
This government doesn't like being challenged to the extent that we're now on day 21 of a government boycott of all its ministers, including the Prime Minister, coming on Good Morning Britain during the biggest health crisis we've had in my lifetime. Is that right for a government to be doing that to a big morning breakfast TV news show?
Of course it's not right. I mean, look, again, in 2009, if I hadn't come on television and explained what was happening, I would have been laughed out of court again. And you've got to come and explain. One of the reasons that we're not making as much progress as we should is that the explanations are not coming forward in the right way. Stay alert is interesting, but get tested. You see, if we had a vaccination, we would be advertising, get vaccinated. That would be all over the billboards, all over television. Ministers would be out there telling people the vaccination is available, get vaccinated. We don't have a vaccination. Social distancing can take us only so far. So can hand washing. These are important, but you need to have testing as well.
Also, Gordon, we have a government that is simply refusing to admit it's made any mistakes. And I think that's very problematic. And the Times leader column today sums up what I've been thinking, which is there's a power in admitting that you've got some things wrong and you're learning as you go. With a pandemic about a virus we know very little about even now. But, it's their refusal. When I see Boris Johnson actually say in the House of Commons that we locked down care homes before the public, and it's a brazen lie, as has been established. When I see Matt Hancock and Michael Gove say we put a protective shield around care homes, and that is a brazen lie. When I see them continue to defend the indefensible, when they said in the middle of March, we're stopping testing because we don't think it's appropriate, and then it turns out a month later they admit, actually, we just didn't have the tests. This all erodes public trust in the government, doesn't it? And you had great periods in government where people had great trust in you, and you had conversely over Iraq and other issues, things where trust went down. But trust is so vital, I think, in a public health crisis.
We had to admit mistakes when mistakes were made, and we should admit mistakes, and mistakes have been made. And I saw Andy Street, the mayor of Birmingham, on, and he had to admit there were mistakes. But if we are going to avoid the problems continuing in the future, we've also got to be ahead of the curve. And we're not ahead of the curve on testing. I tell you another area where we're not ahead of the curve is in planning for what's going to happen to all those service businesses, from restaurants to pubs to hairdressers to fitness clubs to tourist businesses to airline businesses. What's going to happen to them when the loans are no longer available and when the employment protection scheme runs out. And we're going to have to do something other than simply leave it to the banks to call in the loans, bring down the companies, make thousands of people redundant, and make businesses go bankrupt.
What would you be doing